Hello. Welcome to the University of New England. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm Hillary Irons. I'm the Gallery and Exhibitions Director at the University of New England Art Galleries. Welcome to our current exhibit, Home Fires, at the UNE Art Gallery in Portland, Maine. This exhibit, part of the statewide exhibition initiative, Freedom and Captivity, explores the impacts of incarceration on families and loved ones of those who are going through the carceral system. Home Fires features the artwork of the TUG Collective, Carol Ayub, Julie K. Gray, Judy Glickman-Lauder, Forrest Meyer, Mai Snow, Lauren Tosswill, Kim Wilson, and Paul Lacombe. Home Fires is on view through January 23rd, 2021. Tonight, we welcome our guest speaker, Jan Collins. Jan is the Assistant Director of the Maine Prisoner Advocacy Coalition. She became involved with criminal justice reform when her son was incarcerated in 2012. Jan has served on the board of visitors for the Franklin County Jail. She acts as the Maine Prisoner Advocacy Coalition's liaison with the prison branch of the NAACP and regularly testifies before the legislature on issues related to criminal justice reform. Tonight, we're so happy that Jan will be speaking with us in the context of this beautiful exhibition on the topic of children and incarceration. Thank you so much, Jan, and welcome.
Thank you, Hillary, and thanks for putting together that beautiful exhibition. I do want to invite everyone here to add their names and their positions to the chat so that we can all get to know each other. You all come with your own experiences, and many of you are well informed on this topic or have lived experience as well. And we can all work together to do better by the people who are incarcerated in Maine's prisons. Maine Prisoner Advocacy Coalition advocates for the humane treatment of prisoners and supports the families of those who are incarcerated. So I will begin, as Hillary said, my experience comes from my own son being incarcerated, but also I had a father who was incarcerated at Maine State Prison. When I was young, I was terribly embarrassed by the fact that I had a father in prison, and I did my best not ever to mention it or chose not to speak about it, and melted into the woodwork if someone asked where my father was or what he did. That shame is something that many people who have incarcerated loved ones carry with them, and it shaped my life and often shapes the lives of children who are affected by incarceration. Let me just take a moment to share my screen. Hillary will be taking questions in the chat. So if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll be answering them at the end of the program. Thanks for your patience. This is a picture of myself and my 3 siblings. When my father went to prison, my mother had the care of 4 children under the age of 5. My father was the sole breadwinner in our family, and when he left, it meant we were homeless. That's not unusual. The purpose of this presentation is to help us understand the true cost of incarceration with families as well as our economy. The United States, and in order to understand that, we need a little background about how big the problem is. The United States has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's incarcerated population. Even though Maine has one of the lowest incarceration rates in the United States. It still leads most any other country in the world in the number of people who are incarcerated. The question is, has it always been this way? Are we just a country that is prone to wild behavior, antisocial behavior, and that we incarcerate a lot of people? This graph shows the incarceration rate from 1930 to 1970. And we can see that it does vary a little bit, goes up and down, but generally it stays within 100 to 120 people incarcerated per 100,000. In the late 1970s, that changed dramatically. From this graph, you can see that the increase was approximately 7 times what the background incarceration rate was. Suddenly, we were incarcerating people at an incredible rate. What happened? Well, I think lots of things happened, but one of the things that happened that most drastically affected this was the war on crime. We went from thinking of addiction as a health problem to thinking of it as a criminal activity. Once we made that change, we invested a huge amount of money in more police, in more policing, more police cars, more backup for police, more prisons, more courts. All of those things cost us a huge amount of money. From the 1970s to 2010, we spent $1.5 trillion more on the war against drugs. That's the green line in this graph. The blue line in this graph outlines the percentage of people who were addicted. You can see from the blue line that nothing changed, that the background for addiction is the same despite all the expense of fighting the war on drugs. The question is, when you spend $1.5 trillion on the war on drugs, policing, and imprisonment, where does that money come from? Did we just happen to have $1.5 trillion that we didn't know what else to spend it on, so we chose to spend it here? Or does it come from somewhere else? One of the other things that we need to address is the changes that happened in our treatment of the mentally ill. In Maine, AMHI, which was the Maine Mental Health Institute, closed at this time. That wasn't a bad thing. Institutionalizing people with behavioral or mental health issues isn't the way to treat people. And it is not at the highest and best level of treatment. So what we had planned was we would treat them in the community. We would have community resources available to those people. Unfortunately, we closed the institution without funding the community services. And as a result, we had no place for people who were in a critical mental health state to go. As everyone knows, if you have a mental health crisis, you are likely not to behave in acceptable manners. And as a result, our jails and prisons have become our substitute mental health institution in the state of Maine. And that's not just Maine that has done that, but it is also true of prisons around the country. We see that in the number of people who have mental health diagnoses who are incarcerated. This also affected people who served our country as veterans. Many of them suffered from PTSD. That mental health condition led to a disproportionate number of veterans who are incarcerated in our jails and prisons. So is this approach working? are we actually seeing good results from putting people in jails and prisons? Do prisons rehabilitate? Can we expect better behavior from people who have been incarcerated? This is the most recent study released by the Department of Justice of the United States. It included 34 states, one of which was Maine, and it followed these individuals from 2012 to 2017 to see how they fared once released from prison. You can see in the first year, the green line, which is the arrest line, was about 40%. In other words, 40% of the people who were released from prison were rearrested within the first year. By the fifth year, over 70% of the individuals who had been released in this study were returned to prison. That is a failure rate of 70%. By any standard, that's not an acceptable rate. All of these people going to jail or prison have a huge effect on families. When an individual goes to prison, the whole family goes to prison. There are lots of consequences. In Maine, even children go to jail. Until this year, there was no lower limit on the age of children going to prison. This year, we passed a law that said children under age 12 cannot be incarcerated at Long Creek. They must go through the human services system and not through the criminal justice system. Mothers, when they go to jail, have a larger than life effect on the well-being of their children. And in Maine, women are going to prison at a rate never seen before. They are the highest increase in the prison population. Almost all of that increase is due to drug charges. So these are people who are suffering from addiction and as a result are being arrested and criminalized in the system, which has a huge effect on their children. Fathers like my own father who go to prison are often the sole breadwinner or a major breadwinner in the family. And that not only affects the family economically, but it also does socially. This is our first breakout session. I'm going to ask Lee to break us into groups of 4. I would like you in your group to discuss what you think the consequences are to the family of each of these 3 members going to prison or jail, the consequences to them individually and to their families. We're going to give you 6 minutes. The first thing I'd like you to do is to choose someone in your group to be the person reporting back to the rest of us on what you came up with. And then Lee will give you a 60-second countdown when we're at the end of the discussion. And then I will invite you all to come back and have one person share what your group came up with for consequences to the family of incarceration. Lee? for doing that, engaging in this conversation. I probably did not do a good job of explaining what a breakout room was before, but I hope that it worked out okay for everyone. We had a small group of 3 people, and we basically talked about three things: the loss of a home, the loss of social participation for kids, because with only one parent, it's harder to get to school activities and participate in things related to school and sports. And then also the shame, embarrassment, and shunning that comes from having a parent who's been in the news, everybody knows, and that has broken the law. So can I get someone from, I think we're group 4. So can I get someone from group 1 to share what you all talked about?
Sure. Well, we didn't go into everything, but we were just kind of thinking about perspectives of different family members. So just for a second, I'll have Carol talk about the mom's perspective. Jen's going to mention the perspective of people whose child or sibling have been incarcerated. And then Grace, if you want to, it'd be really cool to see what you could say about dads, just very quickly. Thanks. So Carol, you can go right ahead if you'd like.
So you want me to go first?
Yeah.
So in terms of, I spoke about the financial, always putting money on the books. As a mother, I found that I did that when I experienced my son's incarceration. I was the one responsible for trying to keep the bond with the children in the family, and just, trying to keep him positive, because it was a name change. His children changed their names. I never would have dreamt that that sometimes could happen when someone gets kind of thrown away. And even if it's for a few years, a lot can happen. So I'll leave that for now, just a couple of things.
Thanks,
Thank you, Carol.
I think the point about grandchildren is so crucial too. Jen, you want to go ahead?
Sure. From my limited experience, it seems that from the perspective of the child who's incarcerated, what happens to them is they're robbed of their ability to grow in a normal way, in what we would call a normal way, and in making mistakes, experiencing joy, all of those things of being incarcerated gets lost.
All
Thank
right.
you, Jen.
And Grace, go right ahead.
I think something that's really important to my life is having positive role models. And so I think imagining having a parent, I mean, especially like a father who might be the head of the family, become incarcerated, it's a loss of a role model and sort of a path forward through life.
Thanks, that's great.
Thanks, everybody. That was excellent. Could I have someone from group 2?
I think we were group 2, right? My group 2 people. So we kind of broke it down into like children, mothers, and fathers separately. So children, we said, obviously, if they're incarcerated, that their educational process is going to be completely messed up. So then they're going to lack, the needs when they get out, of like how to maintain their own survival, like how to get a job, how to live on their own and make money and all of that, which is crucial. And then they're going to have poor coping skills as well, because obviously being in jail at a young age is going to do some damage to your, whole cognitive thinking and processing. And then when we talked about mothers going to jail, we talked about how they could have guilt because they're leaving their whole family behind and their children. So therefore, they're not going to see their children grow up or go to their soccer games and all of that stuff. And then for fathers, like you said, they're kind of the breadwinners. So then there could be financial issues, and then the family could suffer, and there could be other problems with the family when the husband goes to jail.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ashley. Good job. And group 3.
That might have been us. I'm not sure what number we were. Anyway, we basically said a lot of what everyone else has talked about. In particular, like a teenager, it would give a sense of failure to the parents, and a sense of shame to the family. That would be devastating for everyone concerned. It could potentially lead to things like divorce and worse situations within the family. Otherwise, just anxiety, helplessness, despair, all the things you'd expect, I guess.
Thank you, Bill. And Lee, was that it? 4 groups?
Actually, we got a group 4 and group 5. So there's 5 total groups. So
Okay, so 4 went first. So we'll go with 5 next if we have a 5 available to speak up.
I think our group, I don't know what number we were, 4 or 5, but I feel like everybody here has already outlined pretty much the most common consequences of incarceration. But for us, we talked a lot about the increase in risk factors for children or youth that are incarcerated. So when they return to the community, all those risk factors are just heightened that much more. And that less resources are available for the parent who isn't incarcerated. So when one of the 2 parents is, so many collateral consequences that come alongside of having an income possibly, or having more expenses for the family. A really big consequence is the mourning and the grief, not just in the relationships, but all the practical parts of our lives, right? Like, could be a home, could be a vehicle, could be extended family members. It just goes on and on and on. And then we also talked about shame as a big factor as well, all across the board.
Thank you, Kelly. It's so true. When you go to prison, you lose everything: the house, the car, and mostly the dreams that you have of, a happy family. So there are huge consequences. I'm going to go. I thank you all. You did a terrific job of outlining that. And now I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. I think I'm going to do that. Maybe not. Let's see. There we go. So there are consequences for not only the family, but also for our communities when we over-incarcerate. The Department of Education puts out this graph and a couple of other ones that will follow it. They've got it. They figured it out. When we spend money on prisons, we don't just have a pile of extra money that we're spending on prisons. We have to take it from somewhere else. This graph shows that prison spending outpaces our spending on schools, with Texas outpacing any other state, a 668% faster increase in spending for prisons there than for their schools. Specifically, according to this most recent graph by the Department of Education, state and local corrections expenditures went up 324% in the same period that education went up 107. In Maine, it costs $12,400 and a little bit of change to educate an average public school pupil. This year, it costs $73,000 to keep one person incarcerated at Maine State Prison. That's the facility's costs only. That is not the cost of administration in Augusta that oversees all of the corrections budget. It was $73,000, and we have in Maine a recidivism rate of over 60% in 5 years. Prisons in some states actually get more of the state budget than higher education. All those Black colored states spend more on incarceration than on higher education. Even though education is one of the greatest ways of preventing people from going to prison. The higher your education, the less likely you are to go to prison or jail. In fact, in the state of Maine, when we educate someone who is in prison with a bachelor's degree, they have a less than 10% chance of returning. The investment in education of people who are incarcerated has a 4-to-1 return on the dollar. So you will save $4 for every dollar you invest in education in Maine's prisons. Here are some of the statistics about what happens to children when a parent is incarcerated. 1 in 4 Black children born in 1990 saw a father go to prison. 1 in 30 white children under 14 saw a father go to prison. Notice the great disparity in how we incarcerate people of color. Even in the state of Maine, we have a higher chance of policing someone in a neighborhood who of color. We have a greater chance of actually arresting them. Once they're arrested, we have a greater chance of adjudicating them. And once they're adjudicated, they will have a much higher length of sentence than someone who is of the same color, who is white and does the same crime. We know statistically that people of color are no more likely to use drugs or deal in drugs than someone who is white, but they are 7 times more likely to be arrested for that crime. If your father goes to prison and you're African American, you are 3 times more likely to become homeless than your peers. In Maine, 1 in 14 children had at least one parent incarcerated. 1 in 4 of these children were under the age of 5. What's important to note about this is the high number of children who are affected by their parent being incarcerated. And when we think about the calculations of costs, we should be thinking about the number of children who are going to be affected and the future costs as a result of that. Children with incarcerated parents are twice as likely to develop learning disabilities or anxiety. When your brain is under stress, it's much more difficult to focus. It's much more likely that you will fall behind. If your mother is incarcerated, you have a much greater risk of dropping out of school. Children with incarcerated parents are 3 times more likely to suffer depression or behavioral problems. Children, especially very young children, don't know how to say what they're feeling. Instead, they act it out. And as you probably know, we are putting more and more police in our schools with the nice name of, what is it called? I'm sorry, I'm going to forget the name, but we are putting
a resource officer.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Becky. Yes, a resource officer. It's a fancy name for saying a police officer who's now in the schools. 1980 to 2000, the number of children with a parent prison or jail rose by 500%. 5 million US children have had a parent incarcerated. Many of those families left without that second breadwinner or primary breadwinner are not going to be able to meet their basic needs. They will, if they weren't before, become impoverished. It is important to note that incarceration is a stressful, traumatic experience with the same magnitude as abuse, domestic violence, or divorce. I can't remember which person talked about the cost to them of making sure that their son was able to speak with his children on a regular basis. We should all be aware that there are no free phone calls from prison. And even if you're texting, it costs money if you're texting from prison. And if you need anything other than the most basic needs, you will have to pay for it. Since less than 25% of the people who are incarcerated have any kind of job while they're in prison, that means the families who are already stretched and already stressed financially are the ones who are going to have to take the financial burden of keeping in contact with their loved one. Many of them will be in debt as a result of that. This is a statistic that we should all carry heavy on our hearts. If the incarceration rate had not increased, the US poverty rate would have fallen by 20%. Instead, it rose. And we talked about this when my father went to prison and we had to leave our apartment. I had an uncle who had a farm, and he had this little plywood trailer that he would drag around to county fairs. It had 2 bunks in it, no running water. He did hook it up to electricity. The 5 of us shared those 2 bunks with my mom and my 2 little brothers on the bottom bunk, and my sister tucked into either end of the top bunk. Our plumbing was an outhouse. So let's say we make it through, we're intact and we make it through imprisonment. There are still barriers. Up until October 18th, actually, you would have to put on any job application the fact that you had been incarcerated. That statistically is going to take that application that you just made, and 50% of them will go automatically into the trash bin. They will not be considered at all. Because of the law that was just passed, you will have an opportunity, if you make an application and the employer finds you interesting, to at least get into an interview and explain why you were incarcerated and how you have rehabilitated yourself and what gifts you might bring to that position. You will be unlikely to get any additional training or work experience while you are incarcerated. There are a few jobs that are available. At Maine State Prison, for instance, there is an industries program, but generally those positions go to people who are long-term incarcerated. And the reason they go to those people is because it is important to keep people who are going to be there 30, 40, 50 years, give them something to do that keeps them occupied. So it's often the people who are short-term who are not going to find work experience while they're incarcerated. You'll have to explain your employment history. Why are there big gaps in your history? And it is also likely that if you have been incarcerated, that you will have a low educational attainment and possibly a low literacy level. There are programs to work with people who are interested in getting their high set, and a very, very, very limited number of people who can actually access higher education. This is what my dad did when he was in prison. He did body work on vehicles. There are lots of barriers for people returning. 1 in 5 people returning from prison become homeless. And once you become homeless, your chance of returning to prison skyrockets. You have no way to support yourself. You don't have an address if you are looking for a job. You don't have a way of getting food. It becomes an almost automatic return because you have no resources to care for yourself. Unfortunately, housing is very difficult to get if you have criminal history. Local housing authorities can and have often given their own discretion in turning away people who have a criminal history. So the question becomes, what do? We can see that this is a huge problem that is hurting us individually, families, communities, and our country as a whole. What are your solutions to turning this around? What can we do to change this? And again, I'm going to ask you to go into breakout rooms. And you have 6 minutes, I think, Lee, to come up with some solutions within your group. And please choose someone to represent your group when you return to talk about what the solutions are. Lee? about. But we're going to quickly go through the rooms, and I will share that in our group, we thought that what was really most important was that there be someone to help with reentry, someone there to help find housing, someone there to help get a job, someone to make sure that you were able to get to your medical appointments and stay stable. So all of those things, including housing, were a prime concern of us in our group. And that was group 4. Could I have group 1?
Yeah. So in group 1, we talked about how the community itself as a kind of important mechanism for holding families sort of from early childhood through old age is really crucial to developing a system where people feel supported, where behavioral and mental health differences are recognized and dealt with compassionately. I feel like I'm forgetting something. Carol, Grace, or Jen, what did I miss? Carol, you jump in here.
Sorry, my microphone. I talked a little bit about having a dream about having a team of restorative justice practitioners at every prison, even before we, get rid of them all, but having a team of people that really can help greet a new prisoner, to give them options and thoughts that are just so, in the long term, the true healing takes place with restorative justice, I believe.
Thank you, Carol. Both of those items are prevention items, which I think should be our number one choice. We should prevent people from getting to the point where they're going to be in prison. And we do that by supporting our communities and by doing restorative justice. Thanks. And group 2?
Yeah, so I think my group was group 2. This is Lori speaking, and we had so many ideas. But first off, we thought that substance abuse has to stop being treated as a crime and being treated as an illness. And certainly making personal possession of drugs not a felony, right? Personal possession, just get rid of that. And if we can address substance abuse in a very different way, or substance misuse, then that's a big part of the thing. Also mental illness, right? If we can get people who are mentally ill out of the criminal justice system. So those are really big ones. I do think that the public needs some re-education. I mean, some of the really great statistics that Jan shared with us about funding education versus prison and the recidivism rates. We also wanted to know, sorry, somebody in my group, and I forget her name right this minute, Lanny, I think it was, had such a great question about, are we holding corrections officers or corrections departments accountable for recidivism rates? Like, what do they say they're doing to prevent recidivism? And can we in some way hold them to trying to drop those rates in some way? And more emphasis on work release and also, transition programs, reentry programs. You already said that. So maybe finally, just as an idea, I think, if we could get more visitors kind of into the jails, or people from the jails out into the world to talk about what the experience is really like. I mean, we have a program here at UNE where we bring students into the jails into Cumberland County Jail to do some health workshops. And those students, after that, they get it. It's just that it's this kind of wall, it's this barrier where we don't interact in any way. And I think if we did, we could learn a lot from each other.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much. I especially like your idea of making sure that we all get inside and understand that the people in there are just people, they're just people. And given the right resources, they could also be integrated back into the community. And thank you also for those prevention suggestions as well. And let's see, group 3.
That was us, and we said a lot of the same ideas y'all that we've heard already, mainly about making drugs no longer illegal, but more of a health issue. Also talked about maybe work programs in jails or apprenticeship programs, so that when they got out, they would have some kind of experience that they could kind of bank on to get a job. Also, if they did do any work in the prison or jail system, if that money could somehow be set aside for them for when they get out, to have a way to kind of get back into, to afford some things, as they're transitioning. Also, we wondered if during probation, if they had access to a social worker. If not, why not? And if they do, then that seems. I mean, it seems critical for them to have plenty of social work access, so that they can access what they need and make sure they're getting everything they need as far as housing and jobs and that sort of thing.
Thank you, Bill. That is a great suggestion, that there be some kind of social worker that guides them through the process. Currently, probation officers can have a caseload of 90 people. So it really makes it difficult for them to give the kind of care and attention that's needed to individuals to help them be successful when they're in their communities. So thank you for those suggestions. I think they're really important. And group 5.
So a lot of the things that y'all have mentioned, we talked about, especially we talked about kind of from a prison abolitionist standpoint, talking about restorative justice. And I'll just say I can't start my video because I have main internet. So that is why I have it off. So just letting you know, because if I turn it on, I will be shot out of this. So yes, to continue on that, kind of thinking about, of course, like people mentioned, the roots of the prison industrial complex, the roots of poverty, the roots of racism and things like that. And we mentioned restorative justice, and also the movement that is also known as transformative justice. So kind of taking restorative justice, and it's like the next step in the idea of like sometimes restoring a community is not necessarily what is needed, because there are things in the community that community wants to change. So like it's transforming it into that. So, and we also talked a lot about education and increasing access in prisons and in juvenile facilities, especially for adolescents, because as an occupational therapist, I think about the occupational deprivation that adolescents experience in incarceration, and not only education, but leisure, life skills, peer support, things like that. So kind of thinking about really increasing the presence of that in those areas.
Thank you so much, Julie. And I have to apologize that we are kind of running over here. And I'm going to try to use what you have said as our quick wrap up, because you all came up with the best suggestions. And let me just do this quickly. And I think most important of all are those things that would be preventative in nature, the things that would keep people out of prison in the first place. And, those are, as we mentioned, mental health, addiction recovery systems, education at all levels. Increasing our investment in education will decrease the number of people who are incarcerated. And very, very important, diversion programs, restorative justice programs. We can go through all kinds of recommendations for how to support the children as well. School programs, counseling support, childcare support for a parent to help them be successful so that they don't fall through the cracks as well. And one thing that I think was mentioned actually by, I can't remember who it was, but how important the relationship is between the parent and the child. It is good for both. When the child gets to see their parent regularly, they do better. When the parent gets to see their child regularly, the parent does better. So that is important to strengthen and keep that relationship going. Again, we talked about access to social services, visitation, racial equity, so even if you have a job inside, at Maine State Prison, my son was making 5 cents an hour for his job. And in the most lucrative jobs, they're up to $3 an hour, which is very difficult for anybody to save money for when they get out of prison. And I'll just finish this and then I'll take questions. Almost done. So the answer is strengthen communities. And to remember that, yes, without a doubt, people who break the law should face consequences, and that parents who are incarcerated do not live in isolation. They are fathers, mothers, partners, caregivers, breadwinners, and their kids inevitably end up sharing their sentences. Thank you so much for your patience while I went through all of this. And I am ready to take any questions if people are still willing to stick with us. We're over the time.
All right. So I'm just going to say thank you so much to Jan and to all of our participants. This was a really fantastic event. It was great to hear everyone's ideas. And I'm just curious to know if anyone has a question. You can just either drop it into the chat or ask it directly. I do have one really good question right now from Lori Power. Jan, are your statistics available in one place? I've already put, Lori, a link to the Annie E. Casey, a shared sentence resource in the text chat box. So that's there, but it is interesting to see like where your sources are being drawn from. Jan, is there a place that we can go to find more?
So each statistic is labeled on the slide, but I haven't gathered them in one place. So, so the answer is no, unless you would like to have a copy of my slides, in which case you would get all that information.
Is that something that you could provide to people who are interested?
I'd be glad to.
Oh, thanks. So if anyone's interested in communicating with Jan after the talk, I don't want to offer her personal information, but you can write to me and I can bounce any inquiries to Jan, unless Jan, you feel comfortable putting that info into the chat for people to copy.
Done.
Oh, there it is. Thank you. That's nice. All right. Other questions? I think we had a couple more. I know that Judith maybe had a question.
Yes, you said write to you. First of all, I had no idea. I thought this would be more output than our input, because I feel I know about that much. Can you see about that much? Really, now I see I have to know this much. And so I don't know who to ask what, but to me, the answer is follow the money. This is absolutely crazy. It's crazy. It's not acceptable. And to write you, I guess I could get in touch with the Annie E. Casey Foundation if they're really doing something. But, you know, like I volunteer with different community groups with language, English as a second language. That's not terribly helpful in jail. But as I was saying, you can't even get in without going through if you want to see somebody. By the time I made all the applications and they did a background check and then they had to assure I was vaccinated and had 2 masks and not 2 heads. It's not an easy thing. It's not just marching and knocking on the door and say, look, I'm here to help because you've got problems. But as citizens, we could all do something. And I guess that's what I expected we would have, that we wouldn't be the ones that we could grab something, that a strand that one of us could grab. One of us had the time, one of us could, or we could get our friends involved. We all have, a circle.
Right. Well, I think, Judith, what you're bringing up that's interesting, I'm just going to interrupt here for a second, is that sometimes when we're faced with questions like this, they are very big questions, right? Like they're socially wide-ranging questions. They are questions that are difficult for any one person to answer, and to talk about them together in a group like this, I think is really helpful because it allows us to see like what a kind of community perspective looks like, even on this like micro level, because this issue affects everyone in the community, not just the incarcerated person, not just their family members, but everyone who lives in the society. So I'm going to just see if anybody else has a further question. That was a great point. Thank you. And I appreciate it. Yeah.
If I could just take a minute to say to Judith that everything she does to strengthen her community is making a difference.
Yes.
So I want to say that thank you for teaching English as a second language. It's really important.
Thank you, Jan.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Judith, for all that you do for us in the community. Does anyone have a final question? All right. Well, I just have one really quick one since we're here. I would just like to say that one of the points that we came up with in our little group that I thought was interesting was just the idea that, the incarceration of the family member can begin before that person becomes a mother or father, and it can have kind of reverberating effects through the family even after the carceral period has ended, for someone who subsequently becomes an adult and moves into that society. So there's no real question involved with that. I just thought it was a point that was, really connected to everything you were saying in terms of this being a community issue that we all have to work through. So thanks for kind of allowing that thought to surface and some of these other thoughts and questions as well. Yeah,
I just want to thank everyone for coming, because you may not think that you offered much, but you did. And I learned from every person in the room, and I'm very glad to have spent this time with you. So thanks so much for sharing your interest in this topic. And if there's anything that I can do, please feel free to contact me.
Thank you. And please feel free to contact me too if you want any further information about what we're doing here at the gallery or anything to do with the work that we've been doing together with Jan. Thanks a million, and let's be in touch.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.